Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a cool day here in suburban Chicago. Sort of half cloudy. It looks like it's going to be cloudy. Or it might rain today, but who knows exactly where and when. But I don't think it'll rain in the next 20 minutes, so I'm okay for my walk. I've been thinking about economies and value of money lately because I'm starting to prepare to play Sidereal Confluence. And I don't have a group set up to play it yet, but I'm really looking forward to the possibility. And so in preparation for that, I am starting to read the rules and learn how the game works, etc., etc. And so a Sidereal Confluence is a game of trading and negotiation where you are trading cubes for other cubes and you're trying to get yourself into a situation where you produce lots of good stuff and then hopefully you win the game, I guess. So that's kind of the core of that game. So I wanted to think a little bit about some different kinds of games that I've played and have different kinds of economies and what those economies are meant to do. So here we go. I have 5 different games with different kinds of economies picked out to talk about, and then I'll talk about a couple games that I know of that I haven't played. So there we go. To start with, the very first game that I think most people play that has an economy is Monopoly. If you play Monopoly by the core rules, there's a key question of your ability to evaluate the value of something because auctions are a key part of the Monopoly game. Now, a lot of people don't actually play with the auctions because they play by family rules or whatever. They don't understand, right? The basic idea of Monopoly, you roll, you move. If you land on an unowned property, you can either buy it for the asking price or it goes up for auction and everybody can bid on it, including you. So you could choose not to buy it and then buy it for less. Now, auction games, they're a whole interesting thing, and I'll talk about them later, but I think most people don't actually play Monopoly like an auction game. Instead, they just buy the properties for what they're worth or what they are asked for, which I suspect is less fun. I've never played Monopoly using much in the way of auctions, the way that I think most people do. The other kind of negotiating you do in Monopoly is trying to trade properties one for another. Every property has an inherent value based on which side of the board it's on and what kind of rents you can charge there. But they also have a subjective value based on what other properties you own, right? Owning one of the dark green spaces, which are pretty high value properties, isn't really very effective if you don't own any of the other ones because you can only charge the base rent, then you can't build up on it. You need all 3 in order to build up. So a big part of Monopoly is the negotiation of trading properties for other properties and money and so on. But then at the heart of Monopoly is the idea of running everyone else out of money, which is not fun, I don't think. I suspect there would be a way to impose a time limit on Monopoly that would allow you to pretty reliably figure out who's won and not spend 2 or 3 hours playing the game if you're playing slow. So that's the basic idea of Monopoly as I experience it, right? It is sort of built around real world capitalist income where the person who has more money and stuff is going to make more money and stuff. If you have less money and less stuff, it's going to be harder and harder to make money until you're out on the street. So the next game I want to talk about is Acquire. This is a game I've played a couple times now, once on the XYZ Game Labs stream night, Monday night 2 weeks ago, or at the end of July. We played Acquire, the classic Sid Sackson game. We actually played my 3M bookshelf edition copy, so it's nice and early in the experience. Acquire is interesting because it has this element of wait and see. It has this mix of getting paid for having things get bought out versus getting paid at the end for owning things. Whenever one hotel chain acquired another hotel chain, the majority owner in the smaller hotel chain got an influx of cash, which you can then use to buy shares in other chains. And so the game has a kind of ramping up of wealth based on this idea of careful speculation. If you're able to jump into a hotel chain right before it gets acquired by another hotel chain, that's a crucial shift in the game that I think is pretty great. And one of the really clever moves that Sid Sackson made in creating that game is that you always place your tile and resolve any acquisitions first, and then at the end of turn, you can buy stock. which means that you can't, if you and another player are in a close race, for, say, majority ownership of stock of a particular hotel chain. You can't buy, say, 3 shares to get ahead of them and then merge the hotel and get the acquisition bonus. Instead, you have to merge the hotels first. So somebody is always going to get the option to buy their way back in, assuming they have the money. And that's, again, one of these things where in this game, the amount of money you have in reserve plays a huge role, figuring out when to spend that money and how to use it. So, I mean, one of the things I like about Acquire is this idea of the trade-off between power later in the game, getting money at the end of the game for having the highest value properties, and the need to get cash early in the game in order to keep buying things. So, pretty interesting. That's Acquire from Sid Saxon. Next up, we have Klondike Rush. We've been talking about auction games and about the power of having lots of money. Klondike Rush is purely an auction game. Each round there's an auction and players can bid on whether to acquire a particular card that lets you place stuff on the board. And in that game, I felt like early on the group was spending too much on the properties, so I held back. I did not bid very much in the first half of the game. And as a result, in the second half of the game, I had a huge pile of money compared to everybody else. In the game, you win on other things than money, but as I recall, it's been a long time, but I do recall that by holding back that money, I just owned the second half of the game in auctions. That everybody else was so cash strapped that when it came to auctions in the second half of the game, I was able to win every auction for less than what people were often paying earlier, just because no one else could outbid me. And it got to the point where it wasn't fun for them, and it really wasn't fun for me. Like it wasn't a situation where it was enjoyable to revel in my victory, but at the same time, I feel like playing optimally is the key way to play a game, and I didn't want to lowball that. So there was an interesting tension there, but it really does speak to valuation as a key factor. I already talked about this a little bit in Monopoly, that in a lot of games that have trading or negotiation, your ability to figure out what the value of the thing is, especially compared to the value of other things, is pretty interesting. Now, one of the auction games that I have that I've played a few times and I enjoy is Vault Wars. Now, Vault Wars is an auction game in which, you remember, the premise is that it's sort of like Storage Wars, the show about people who go and bid on property that's been abandoned in storage units. In Vault Wars, you go and what you're bidding on is these vaults where treasure from adventurers has been kept, and those adventurers have gone, so it's a fantasy world. Adventurers have gone off on their adventures, they come back with all sorts of treasure, they leave it in these vaults while they go off to other treasures, and then the adventurers don't come back, they die or whatever, and these vaults are left unowned. And so then the people who run the bank where the vaults are auction off the property. And the way they do it is just like in Vault Wars, or in Storage Wars, you can only see what's visible. And so you're trying to value the lot of merchandise without knowing everything that's in it. So that's where the obscurity comes from in that game, is that you can't see everything that's in the vault. By contrast, with something like Acquire, which isn't an auction game, with something like Klondike Rush, I think you can see, as I recall, you could see everything you're bidding on. And it's just a matter of recognizing what is the rhythm of the game, when are you going to refresh your capital. As I recall, you get one refresh during the game. And so, yeah, the ebb and flow of the money in that game is pretty interesting. And in an auction game, you're not only auctioning the current lot, you're also looking ahead to the future lots and saying, how much money does everybody have? Because the more money people spend early, the less they have to spend later. Which is, again, an interesting dynamic and something fun to think about. Though auctions tend to be pretty, again, they have that capitalist bent where somebody who has the most can continue to get the most. You know, the auction game that I think is perhaps the best for this reason is the Reiner Knizia game, High Society. In High Society, they have this large pool of fancy things that you want to buy. And each of them is worth different points. And each player has these different cards that have money values on them. And you all have the same set of money value cards, as I recall. And the idea is you are bidding on these High Society items and acquiring them, and those give you points. But there is a rule if you are the person who has the least money left at the end of the game, then you lose because you're not high society anymore. You spent all your money. So you want to keep your role in high society, but also acquire enough points that you win the game. So again, it's not just about valuation, but about valuation and the context of other people. I haven't played a ton of auction games, so I don't know if this is true, if this continues to be true, but I imagine it would. So anyway, that was Klondike Rush from Red Raven Games, designed by Ryan Lockett. Next up, we have Clans of Caledonia, which uses a supply and demand market. Now, there are lots of other games that do that. I have 2 others in my collection for sure. Honey Buzz does this, and although Honey Buzz, it's just a demand. It's just about how much has been sold. There is no rise again. And Raccoon Tycoon is the most direct up and down market. But in all 3 of these, you have a market for goods, and you have ways of producing the goods. And then at various times you can choose to sell the goods for the value that they are currently needed in the market. And those values go up and down over the course of the game. So you get this ebb and flow where you're trying to figure out what is the best pattern to follow in terms of trying to get money for the goods that you're selling. And that one, again, feels like a market in terms of trying to read who's about to sell what, trying to sell just before somebody or just after somebody else. I think I mentioned in my discussion of Raccoon Tycoon, I had found a combo where I got the card that let me raise the value of goods by 3. And then I got another card that let me buy out someone else's goods from them. And so several times I had a thing where I saw somebody had a bunch of goods stacked up, and I would buy their goods from them at the current market rate. And then I would go to sell the goods, and I would sell them at the market rate plus 3, which was mine. So I would just instantly make 3 money on each of their goods, which, sometimes was like 10 or 15 money, which is pretty good. In the end, it turned out I was not paying attention to the rest of the stuff I needed to, and I was too fascinated with my own ability to do that to win the game. But the manipulation of money markets has been a big part of games like this for a long time. Probably the earliest game I played that had that was Power Grid. Power Grid had resources that cost a certain amount, and as you buy them, the resources become more expensive until there's a point where you just literally can't buy them anymore. There's none available. Brass has that as well. Once you're connected to the coal and iron markets, then it becomes possible to buy coal and iron from the open market. And the more people do that, the more expensive coal and iron get. And conversely, when you build a factory, an iron works or a coal mine, if you're connected to the network when you build it, you immediately supply the network and those prices go back down. But I think the monetary manipulation of something like Raccoon Tycoon or Clans of Caledonia is slightly different than the manipulation of goods for money like we see in Brass. Nonetheless, Brass and the other Martin Wallace games like London are crucial games to pay very close attention to the money that you're spending, because often they have loans, and the loans can be quite punishing if you aren't prepared for them or you aren't ready for what they do. So those are 4 different market models. I guess I was going to talk about Brass a little bit more, but I'm not sure what else I have to say about it, except that Brass is interesting because it has a shared economy that's pretty compelling. So in Brass, you're dealing with your income as well as with your cash. And your cash is money you get for buying cash is money that you have for buying things or doing things. And your income is money that is the setting that allows you to get money each round, which determines how much you have to do all these other things. And the way the income works is that whenever you do a thing, you gain income based on what that thing is. So if you open a coal mine, as long as the coal mine is still producing coal but hasn't sold it all, you don't get any income from that. But as soon as the coal mine has sold that coal, either to another player, or you can sell it to the open market, but only if it's available when you build your coal mine. As soon as that coal mine is empty of the coal that's on it, then you flip it over and it becomes income for you. And the narrative explanation there is that the coal mine is producing a certain amount of coal each year, and you are getting the income from that. And when you're selling a coal, that represents a contract for, say, a third of the coal that the mine produces, which is a really great way of making abstract this process of selling things. And the idea that if you're running a textile factory, you need coal all the time. And it would be not interesting game-wise to constantly have to be buying the coal. So instead, the way the game does it is that you buy the coal, or when you set up your factory, you connect to the coal that's on the board, and then you're able to start your factory, and that person is able to flip their coal mine tile and gain income from that coal mine. So I really like how that one works. So there are 3 games that are market related that I haven't played and I think would make interesting addendums to this conversation. So if you've played any of these and want to participate in the conversation over on Board Game Geek, we are in Guild 3269, and I would love to have your feedback about these things. So the first of these is a legendarily vicious game that's also very unforgiving. So if you make a mistake early in the game, it doesn't give you a chance to catch up. That's not a thing this game does. It also apparently has a heavy amount of sort of cutthroat action or undercutting each other, and that is Food Chain Magnate. Now, Food Chain Magnate is a game from Splotter Spielen, and they make very heavy, super vicious, sort of quirky games. And this one is about, running fast food chains. So you can open a hamburger stand, or you can open a pizza stand. You can sell soft drinks and whatnot. And the game is supposed to be incredibly aggressive economically, that you can get to a point where you just don't have the money to pay your workers or do a thing, or you could spend a bunch of money marketing a product and then someone else comes in and undercuts your price or your location. And so it's really a cutthroat game, almost back to something like Acquire or Monopoly, where you're really working to stab each other. Not a game I've played, and probably not a game I will play, just because I generally don't like games that are that vicious. Another game that would be interesting to know about is Stockpile. Stockpile is sort of like an auction game. You're building up these piles of stocks and trying to get people to invest in them. And if you can get people to invest in the one that has the bad stocks in it, then when the stocks go down, that person is kind of screwed. It's sort of like insider trading, the board game. So there are 2 other games, one that I have and one that I do not, both of which I think are pretty interesting. The first one, the Tulip Boom, I do not have. The Tulip Boom is about the famous rush on tulip plants in the late 1500s, early 1600s in Denmark, where people suddenly went crazy for different kinds of tulips, and the value of the tulips and the tulip bulbs particularly skyrocketed to the point that people were investing their entire family savings in tulips. And then, of course, at some point people realized they were spending tons and tons of money on these flowers, and the market collapsed. And of course, lots of people lost lots of money, and other people made away with plenty. It is the quintessential game of the bubble economics. Now, I haven't played the actual game, so I don't know what it is. My guess is the point of the game is to get as much money as you can and get out of the market before it collapses. And the person who has the most money at the end of the game wins. But yeah, that's interesting to see. It's interesting to see that someone made a game out of that theme, and it would be definitely one I'd want to try at some point. It's currently out of print as far as I know, so it's not a game I would pick up unless I happen to come across it in a math trade or something. The other game that I enjoy that I would like to, or the other game that I have that I would like to try is from Tasty Room Minstrel Games. That's Ponzi. Ponzi is, of course, a game about trying to make money using the Peter and Paul scheme. A Peter and Paul scheme is one where it is the formal name of the financial scheme that Charles Ponzi was famously charged with, and Charles Ponzi then became the famous namesake for this maneuver, which is basically where you take investments from people for some sort of product, and you claim the product has a very high rate of return. And then you take investments from other people later, and then when their investments come due, you pay their investments off with money from the second people. And then, of course, you can let those people have their investment ride, let them keep their investment in the company, in which case you never had to pay out to begin with. Or if you pay them out, then they're satisfied and they tell other people how great it is, and those people come in and pay in. And then with the new money coming in, you're able to pay off the next round of people when their notes come due, and so on. Now, the beauty of of a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme is that it keeps working as long as the base of the pyramid keeps getting bigger. And the person at the top continues to make money as the scheme gets bigger and bigger. Of course, it fails as soon as you can't get enough people. Then you start missing your payouts and everyone wants their money back, and it turns out there wasn't enough money to pay everybody what they're owed. I thought of this particularly because the name for this scheme is a Peter from Paul scheme. It comes from the old phrase, robbing Peter to pay Paul, which comes out of England. There was a time where St. Paul's Cathedral needed repairs and they didn't have the funds. And so the British Church took money from St. Peter's Cathedral to fix St. Paul's Cathedral. There you go. Robbing Peter to pay Paul. And the idea is you're taking money from one pot to pay for another pot that isn't meeting its goals. In this case, I thought of it because this is a common problem in the indie board game industry, where people will run a Kickstarter to produce a product, and then that product will be delayed and their costs will go over. And so then the company will run another Kickstarter to produce another product and use the money from the second Kickstarter to help pay for the first one, on the earnest grounds that when they sell the remaining stock from the first one, they'll be able to pay for the second one. And of course, if they're late again or they're unable to sell that stock, then they get into a situation where they can't produce the second one either, and they have to produce a third one and so on. Or they don't make enough off the first one to pay for the second one, etc. So this is a fairly common thing, and I guess I thought of it because Tasty Minstrel Games, a stalwart in the board game community, has recently run out of money, and they actually had to refund the money for one of their Kickstarters because they did not have enough money to produce it. And it made me think of Charles Ponzi, which I'm not saying Tasty Minstrel was using Ponzi style financing. I have no idea if that's true or not. I'm not even kind of suggesting it. But it has certainly been a documented thing in other companies that use Kickstarter. And Tasty Minstrel Games released the game Ponzi Scheme. So it seems like, or Ponzi, I think is the name of the game. And so, that's a thing that I was thinking about. And then I brought it to you. So what financial games or what financial models have you found interesting in the games that you play? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share in the conversation. Let me know what financial games you enjoy and what schemes you think are interesting for the subject of board games. You can also email me, Brendan at Rattlebox Games, or you can join me on one of the asynchronous game platforms like Board Game Arena, where we can play a game. You can find my username there, Wombat929. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.